All right, number 2. A square field has sides of 75 feet. About how far is it from one corner of the field to the opposite corner of the field? Round your answer to the nearest tenth. So, we've got a square here. Of course, you know if it's a square, that means that all four sides are the same. All right, in this question, they told us that the sides are all 75 feet. They want to know how far it is from one corner to the other corner of the field, or in other words, they want to know how long the diagonal is. Well, as you can see now, we've drawn in a right triangle, so it's pretty easy to see here how the Pythagorean theorem applies here. Here's your right angle, so if we're looking at this guy up here at the top, here's my right triangle. I've got the legs of the right triangle, the two sides that make up the right angle. I'm obviously finding the hypotenuse here. Alright, so what are we told here? Well, we're going to find the distance from one corner of the field to the opposite corner of the field. We drew a segment from one corner of the field to the opposite corner of the field, dividing the field into two right triangles, as you saw. The segment between those two corners is the hypotenuse, again, as you saw, and the sides of the field are the legs, again, which you saw, and they each happen to be 75 feet long. Well, since I have two sides of the right triangle, I can use the Pythagorean theorem to solve to find the third side. So that's exactly what I intend to do here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the two legs, 75 and 75, squared and added up is going to be the same as my hypotenuse squared here. So 75 squared is 5625, same for the other one, equals the hypotenuse squared. Add those up, I get 11,250. So the hypotenuse squared is equal to 11,250. Now again, the issue here is I don't want to know the hypotenuse squared. I just want to know the hypotenuse. So we're going to finish here by getting back to hypotenuse, getting back to regular C, by taking the square root, which is exactly what they're telling me to do right here. Take the square roots of both sides. When I take the square root of C squared, I get back to C, which means now I'm just finding the regular hypotenuse, which is great. And here I'm taking the square root of 11,250, and I get 106.066012. So the length of the diagonal, the length from one corner of the field to the other, is about 106.066012. In this question, it was feet, or about 106.1 feet long, which is what they're showing you here at the top of the next page, 106.1 when they rounded here. So the distance from one corner of the field to the opposite corner is about 106.1 feet. Again, our answer makes sense because, as I explained in the last one, because the two legs, you're adding them up and squaring them, are always going to generate a bigger number here. The hypotenuse always has to be a larger number as well. Since the hypotenuse here was the longest answer, the biggest answer I got, the longest side of that right triangle, that answer makes sense from that perspective. So that distance from corner to the opposite corner being 106.1 feet is very logical. All right, so here, number 1, we're going to use the theorem to find the missing measure. Once again, here you're finding C, which is great. So we're going to go ahead and plug in our numbers into the theorem. Now, these two guys, again, have to be the legs. How do I know that? Because they're making the right angle up here. All right, they're the two sides that make the right angle. This guy here, C, is the hypotenuse, not just because it's labeled, but as you can see from my arrow, it's across from the right angle in the triangle. So the formula says take the legs and square them and add them up. 11 squared plus 15 squared. That's going to be the same as my hypotenuse squared, C squared. 11 squared is 121. 15 squared is 225. And I set those equal to each other equals C squared. So when I add those two guys up, I add up 121 and 225, and I get 346. All right, well again, I don't want to know the hypotenuse squared, I just want to know the hypotenuse here. So if I want to know the hypotenuse here, now what I'm going to do is take the square root, because when I want to undo a square, square root does the job because they're opposites of each other, just like adding and subtracting, just like multiplying and dividing here. So I'm going to go ahead and take the square root all the way across now here. And when I take the square root of 346, the solution is 18.601075, and it keeps going. Since we're rounding here, we're going to say this is about 18.6 centimeters. And that's going to be the length of my hypotenuse. Again, it makes sense because the hypotenuse here ends up being the longest side. The biggest number is 18.6, so it makes sense. All right, let's look at number 2, a story problem. Not totally different than the one we did earlier, except it's a different shape, but still the same idea. It says a rectangular field has a length of 100 yards and a width of 33 yards. They want to know how far it is from one corner of the field to the opposite, and then they were asking you to round your answer to the nearest 10. Well, here's my rectangle sketched out. Here's obviously my right angle, and I'm finding the length of the diagonal. So the diagonal is obviously the hypotenuse, because the hypotenuse is, of course, what's across from the right angle. So I'm finding C. I know A and B, because my legs are the two sides that make up the right angle of the triangle. Those are my 33 and my 100. So the formula says I'm going to take those two guys and square them and add them up, and that's going to be the same as the hypotenuse squared. Well, a little bit of quick calculation here. 33 squared, 33 times 33, one you probably don't know off the top of your head, 1,089. And 100 squared, you can do that one in your head. Just take a 1 and add 4 zeros to it, otherwise known as 10,000. So we add those two guys up, and we get 11,000 even 89. 11089 is going to be equivalent to the hypotenuse squared. Well, I don't want to know the hypotenuse squared is the issue. I want to know just the hypotenuse. So to get from hypotenuse squared back to hypotenuse now, I take the square root. And when I take the square root of that number there, take the square root of 11,089, doing the same thing to c squared because I want to get back to hypotenuse, I end up with a solution of 105.30432089900205. It's one of those numbers that goes on forever, but they rounded here. They rounded the square root of 11,089 off to 105.304 or 105.3. So this hypotenuse has to be 105.3 yards. Again, makes sense. It's the longest side of the right triangle. Since my number there happened to be the biggest number, that answer is logical.